Your mom is dead. So what? You better serve my guests or you can sleep on the street tonight. My husband's words cut through me like a knife as I stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing the black dress I'd put on just hours ago after getting the call from the hospital. The guests in our dining room went silent. I could feel their eyes on me as tears began streaming down my face. But it was what happened next. What his boss said standing up from that table, that would change everything. The man's voice was cold as ice when he spoke. Everyone knew your wife's mother except you, apparently. She was my sister, and now let me tell you exactly what's about to happen to your career, your house, and your pathetic excuse for a life. Before we get into this story, I'm going to ask you for something very quick. Hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. This way we can keep growing and bring you even more intense stories like this one. Now let's dive in. But to understand how heavy those words really were, and why that dinner party became the beginning of my husband's complete destruction, we have to go back. Not just a few hours, but 7 years. 7 years to the day I met Marcus Chen at a charity fundraiser in downtown Seattle. I was 23, fresh out of nursing school, wearing a dress my mother had saved for months to buy me. Marcus was 28, sharply dressed, and he had this smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, or so he said. He drove a leased BMW, lived in a nice apartment in Capitol Hill, and he pursued me with an intensity that felt like love. My mother, Catherine, had her doubts from the beginning. She was a quiet woman, a seamstress who had immigrated from the Philippines 30 years earlier, who had raised me alone after my father died when I was 6. She worked in a small alteration shop in the International District, hunched over her sewing machine 12 hours a day to give me a better life. When I brought Marcus home for the first time, she made her famous lumpia and pancit, setting the table with the good plates we only used for special occasions. Marcus barely touched the food. He kept checking his phone, making comments about how small our apartment was, asking when we could leave. After he went to use the bathroom, my mother grabbed my hand. Her English was accented, but her meaning was clear. Anak, this man, he look at you like you are thing, not person. Be careful. I laughed it off. I was young and in love, or what I thought was love. I told her she was being old-fashioned, that Marcus was just nervous meeting her. But mothers know, they always know. We got married 8 months later in a small ceremony at City Hall. Marcus said he didn't want a big wedding, that it was a waste of money. I didn't argue. I never argued with Marcus. That was the first lesson I learned in our marriage. That peace was more important than being right. That silence was safer than disagreement. My mother came to the ceremony wearing her best dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons she'd made herself. She held my hand and whispered a prayer in Tagalog, asking God to protect me. She cried during the vows, and I thought it was because she was happy. I know now she was crying because she knew what I was too blind to see. That I was marrying a man who would spend the next 7 years slowly destroying the person I was, piece by piece, smile by smile, until I didn't even recognize myself anymore. The first year wasn't so bad. Marcus was attentive, bringing home flowers occasionally, taking me to nice restaurants. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Ballard, nothing fancy but clean and bright, with big windows that let in the Seattle rain and gray light. I worked night shifts at Swedish Hospital, 12-hour stretches in the pediatric ward, coming home exhausted to find Marcus usually asleep or out with clients. He said pharmaceutical sales required a lot of entertainment, a lot of dinners and drinks and networking. I believed him because I wanted to, because the alternative, that he was lying, that he was slowly building a separate life I knew nothing about, was too painful to consider. My mother would call me every morning after my night shifts. She'd ask how I was sleeping, if Marcus was treating me well, if I needed anything. I always said everything was fine, perfect. Even I'd describe dinners we'd had, weekend trips we'd taken, making our life sound like a romance novel when the truth was becoming harder and harder to hide. The truth was that Marcus had started to change. The flowers stopped coming. The nice restaurants were replaced by him going out alone while I stayed home. When I'd asked to join him, he'd say I'd be bored, that it was work stuff, that I wouldn't understand the medical terminology they'd be discussing. So I'd stay home, watching Netflix, falling asleep on the couch, waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning to find him stumbling in, smelling like whiskey and perfume that wasn't mine. Around our 2nd anniversary, my mother got sick. It started small, just some fatigue, some shortness of breath she'd mention on our calls. She'd brush it off, say it was just age, just working too much. But I'm a nurse. I knew something was wrong. I convinced her to go to the doctor, even made the appointment myself at the hospital where I worked. The diagnosis came back like a death sentence. Stage 3 heart failure. Years of overwork, of stress, of sacrificing her own health to give me opportunities had caught up with her. The cardiologist said she needed to stop working immediately, that she needed rest and medication and careful monitoring. I remember sitting in that consultation room, holding my mother's small, calloused hand, and feeling the world tilt sideways. She was only 50. She was supposed to have decades left, supposed to see grandchildren, supposed to finally rest after a lifetime of labor. I drove her home that day in silence. She stared out the window at the gray Seattle streets, at the place she'd made her home for 30 years, and said nothing. When we got to her small studio apartment above the alteration shop, I helped her up the narrow stairs and made her tea. We sat at her small kitchen table, the same table where she'd helped me with homework as a child, where we'd eaten countless meals together, just the two of us against the world. Anak, she said finally, her voice quiet. I need to stop working. But the rent, the bills, the medicine, it's too much. I don't know how I will manage. My heart broke. My mother, who had given me everything, was asking for help, and I could see the shame in her eyes, the humiliation of needing her daughter after a lifetime of being the provider. I told her not to worry. I told her Marcus and I would help, that we'd figure it out together. When I got home that night and explained the situation to Marcus, I expected compassion. I expected him to put his arm around me, to tell me of course we'd help. That family was important. Instead, he exploded. He asked me how much money I thought we had, if I'd looked at our bank account lately, if I understood that he had expenses, that his lifestyle required a certain level of income. I stared at him, confused. We both worked. I made decent money as a nurse. He supposedly made good money in pharmaceutical sales. We had no children, no major debts. Where was all the money going? He waved away my questions, said I didn't understand finance, that I was being emotional and irrational. He said we could give my mother $200 a month and not a penny more. $200 for the woman who had given everything so I could become a nurse, so I could have the life I had. I gave her $500 a month. I did it by taking extra shifts, by skipping lunches, by cutting back on everything I spent on myself. I told Marcus I'd gotten a raise to explain the missing money. He didn't question it because he didn't care enough to question it. And for the next 3 years, that's how we lived. Me working myself to exhaustion to support my mother, lying to my husband about money, watching my mother's health slowly decline despite the medications and the rest. Marcus growing more distant, more critical, more cruel in small ways that accumulated like drops of water wearing a waystone. He'd criticize my cooking, saying my mother had taught me to make peasant food, that he couldn't bring clients home when all I knew how to make was rice and adobo. He'd comment on my body, saying I'd gained weight, that I needed to dress better, that I was letting myself go. He'd forget my birthday, our anniversary, every important date. But he'd remember to tell me about the promotions his colleagues were getting, the beautiful wives they had, the expensive vacations they took. Every word was designed to make me feel small, insufficient, lucky that he'd chosen me when clearly I wasn't good enough for him. And I absorbed it all because I'd been trained since childhood to be quiet, to be respectful, to not make waves. My mother had taught me to be a good wife, to support my husband, to build a home. She hadn't taught me how to recognize when a man was systematically destroying my self-worth because she'd never imagined I'd marry someone who would. Then came the promotion. Marcus came home one Tuesday evening with a bottle of champagne and a smile wider than I'd seen in years. He'd been promoted to regional sales director. The salary increase was substantial, he said, enough to finally move us out of our apartment and into a house. He was taking over the Pacific Northwest Territory, and his new boss, a senior vice president named Richard Thornton, was coming to town. Marcus wanted to host a dinner party to make a good impression, to show he was serious and professional and capable. He needed me to plan it, to make it perfect, to finally prove I could be the kind of wife a man in his position deserved. The way he said it, like I'd been failing him all these years, like this was my chance to redeem myself, made my stomach turn. But I agreed because that's what I did. I agreed and I smiled and I started planning a dinner party to impress a man I'd never met, to help a husband who treated me like hired help, The dinner was scheduled for a Thursday evening, 3 weeks out. Marcus gave me a budget and a guest list. 6 people, including him, Richard Thornton and his wife, Marcus's colleague David and his girlfriend, and Marcus and me. He wanted it catered, he said, with real food, not the Filipino dishes I usually made. I nodded and took the list and began making calls. The catering alone was going to cost $800. The wine Marcus insisted on was another $300. New dishes, new tablecloth, new everything, because what we had wasn't good enough. I watched our savings account drain and said nothing, just took more overnight shifts. Just kept telling myself this was important. This was for our future. This was what a good wife did. My mother's health had been declining more rapidly that fall. The medications weren't working as well. She was tired all the time, sleeping 16 hours a day sometimes. I'd been stopping by her apartment every day after my shifts, bringing groceries, making sure she was taking her pills, helping her with small tasks that had become monumental, like changing sheets or washing dishes. She'd gotten so thin I could see every bone in her hands when she gripped mine. Her cardiologist had said she might need a procedure, an expensive procedure that her insurance wouldn't fully cover. I'd been trying to figure out how to come up with the money, taking on even more shifts, barely sleeping, running on coffee and adrenaline, and the desperate need to save the only parent I had left. 2 days before the dinner party, on a Tuesday morning after a particularly brutal 12-hour shift, I stopped by my mother's apartment. I had a key and I let myself in quietly, not wanting to wake her if she was sleeping. The apartment was silent, too silent. I walked to her bedroom and found her there. In her bed, her hands folded on her chest like she was praying. She looked peaceful, like she was just sleeping, but when I touched her hand, it was cold. My mother was gone. She had died sometime in the night, alone, in that small studio apartment above the alteration shop where she'd spent so many years hunched over her sewing machine trying to give me a better life than she'd had. I can remember much of what happened next. I remember calling 911, my voice not sounding like my own. I remember the paramedics coming, confirming what I already knew. I remember calling the hospital to say I couldn't come in for my shift. I remember sitting on my mother's bed for hours, holding her hand even though it was cold, not wanting to let go because letting go meant accepting she was really gone. Her neighbors, the other Filipino families who lived in the building, came to sit with me. They brought food and prayers and tears. Mrs. Santos, who had known my mother for 20 years, held me while I sobbed, rocking me like I was a child, whispering that my mother was with God now, that her suffering was over, that she had raised a good daughter, and that was her legacy. I finally called Marcus around noon. He answered on the 5th ring, his voice irritated. "What?" "I'm in a meeting." I told him my mother had died. There was a pause. Then he said, "Okay. Are you going to be able to handle the dinner on Thursday?" I felt something inside me crack. Not break, not yet, but crack. Like ice beginning to splinter. I told him yes, I'd handle it, and hung up before he could say anything else. Mrs. Santos looked at me with such sadness in her eyes, such understanding, and I knew she'd heard. I knew she'd heard my husband's response to my mother's death, and I felt shame wash over me, hot and suffocating. Shame that I'd married a man who could be so cold. Shame that I was still planning his dinner party instead of screaming at him, instead of demanding he see me, really see me, for the first time in 7 years. The next 2 days passed in a fog. I made arrangements for my mother's body, choosing the cheapest option because I didn't have money for anything else. I called her friends, her church, telling them the news and breaking down with each call. I went through her things, her small collection of possessions, each item a memory. Her sewing kit with needles organized by size. Her photo albums with pictures of me at every age, every achievement, every moment she deemed important enough to preserve. Her jewelry box with the simple gold necklace my father had given her, the one she never took off until the day she died. I put it around my own neck, and it felt like her arms around me one last time, and through it all, I planned the dinner party. I called the caterer and confirmed the menu. I bought the wine Marcus wanted. I cleaned the apartment until it gleamed. I set the table with the new dishes and the new tablecloth. I ironed Marcus's shirts and laid out his favorite tie. I did everything a good wife was supposed to do while my heart was breaking, while I was making arrangements to bury my mother, while my husband didn't ask once how I was doing or if I needed anything. He'd come home late both nights, barely speaking to me, focused on preparing for his boss's visit. When I'd mention my mother, he'd change the subject or leave the room. On Wednesday night, the night before the party, I'd tried to talk to him about the funeral arrangements. He'd told me we'd deal with it after the dinner. That this party was too important to be distracted. That's when I should have left. That's when I should have packed a bag and walked out and never looked back. But I didn't because I'd been trained to be silent, to be accommodating, to put everyone else's needs before my own. Because I'd spent 7 years being slowly broken down until I didn't believe I deserved better. Because I was grieving and exhausted and I couldn't think clearly enough to see that. I was living with a monster. Thursday arrived. The day of the dinner party, the day I was supposed to be planning my mother's funeral, but instead, I was preparing duck and arranging flowers and making sure everything was perfect for my husband's boss. I woke up early, my mother's gold necklace still around my neck, and got dressed. I stood in my closet trying to decide what to wear, and my eyes fell on the black dress hanging in the back. A simple dress, high-necked, respectful. I'd bought it years ago for a funeral and never worn it since. My hand reached for it automatically. It felt right, wearing black. It felt like the only honest thing I could do, so I put it on, let my hair down, and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like I was going to a funeral, because, in a way, I just didn't know yet that it was the funeral for my marriage, for the woman I'd been, for the life I'd thought I was living. The caterer arrived at 4 to set up. The food smelled incredible, rich and expensive. The duck was glazed and perfect. The sides were artfully arranged. The dessert was something French with a name I couldn't pronounce. It all felt obscene somehow. This abundance, this excess, on the day I should have been mourning my mother in peace. Marcus came home at 5, showered and changed, and walked through the apartment inspecting everything like a general reviewing troops. He straightened a fork here, moved a glass there, and didn't say a word to me except to ask if I'd remembered to chill the expensive wine. Of course I had. I'd remembered everything because I was the perfect wife doing her perfect duty. The guests arrived at 7 exactly. Marcus opened the door with his big sales smile. The one I'd seen him practice in mirrors. The one that never reached his eyes. David and his girlfriend came first. Both young and polished and talking too loudly about a restaurant they'd been to in Vancouver. They barely glanced at me. Then came Richard Thornton and his wife. Richard was in his 60s, tall and distinguished with silver hair and a cane with a silver handle. He had the kind of presence that made you stand straighter. Pay attention. His wife was elegant, quiet, wearing pearls and a kind smile. Richard's eyes landed on me and lingered for a moment on my black dress, on my face that I knew was swollen from crying, on the gold necklace at my throat. His expression changed, something flickering across his features too fast for me to read. Then Marcus was introducing me, his voice bright and false. And I was shaking hands and murmuring greetings and leading everyone to the dining room. Dinner started well enough. The food was praised, the wine was poured. Marcus was performing. He told jokes and stories, laughed loudly at Richard's comments, positioned himself as the perfect employee, ambitious but loyal, confident but respectful. David chimed in with industry gossip and his girlfriend laughed at all the right moments. I served courses and refilled glasses and tried to be invisible, which was what Marcus had made clear he wanted. But I could feel Richard watching me. Every time I came near the table, his eyes would follow me, not in a predatory way, but with a kind of intense curiosity that made me uncomfortable. I wondered if there was something wrong with the food, if I'd made some error in the service. If I was embarrassing Marcus somehow. We were halfway through the main course when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I'd forgotten to leave it in the kitchen. I ignored it, but it vibrated again, insistent. Marcus shot me a look across the table, his eyes hard. "Excuse me," I murmured and slipped out to check it. It was the funeral home. They needed to confirm some details about my mother's service, about the casket, about the timing. I texted back quickly that I'd call them later and returned to the dining room. But seeing that message, seeing my mother's name on the screen, it broke something loose inside me. The tears started before I could stop them. Just silence streams down my face as I picked up plates and brought out the next course. "Are you crying?" Marcus's voice cut across the table conversation. Everyone stopped talking. I wiped my face quickly, tried to smile. "I'm fine. Just dust or something." But he wouldn't let it go. He stood up from his chair, walked over to me, and grabbed my wrist hard enough to hurt. "What is wrong with you?" he hissed, his voice low enough that I thought maybe the others couldn't hear. "Are you trying to ruin this dinner? Are you trying to embarrass me?" I pulled my wrist free and whispered, "My mother died 2 days ago." The words came out before I could stop them, before I could remember to be silent, to be accommodating, to protect his image. His face went red. He looked at the table, at his boss and colleagues watching this domestic scene unfold, and then he laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was harsh and cruel and designed to humiliate. "Your mom is dead," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "So what? You better serve my guests or you can sleep on the street tonight." The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. I felt like I'd been slapped, like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there with tears streaming down my face while my husband, the man I'd spent 7 years trying to please, made it clear exactly how little I meant to him. I saw David look away, uncomfortable. His girlfriend stared at her plate. Richard's wife had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. But Richard Thornton stood up. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, his face a mask of controlled fury. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Marcus. "What did you say?" His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Marcus take a step back. "I said," Marcus started, but Richard cut him off. "I heard what you said. I'm giving you a chance to take it back." Marcus tried to smile, tried to laugh it off. "Sir? She's just being emotional. Women, you know how they Richards." Cane hit the floor hard, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. "That woman," he said, his voice rising now, "is wearing black because she's in mourning. That woman is crying because someone she loved has died. And you pathetic excuse for a man, you told her it doesn't matter. That serving dinner is more important than her grief." "Mr. Thornton, I can explain." Marcus's voice had gone high and desperate. Richard held up his hand. "Everyone knew your wife's mother except you, apparently." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were gentle now, sad and gentle, because she was my sister. Catherine Reyes was my sister. The world stopped. I stared at this man, this stranger, and tried to make sense of his words. My mother's brother, my mother had a brother. She'd never mentioned family in America, never mentioned anyone. Richard turned back to Marcus, and his face was stone. "My sister Catherine left home 30 years ago to escape our father's abuse. She cut ties with everyone to keep herself and her daughter safe. I've been looking for her for decades, hiring investigators, checking records, hoping to reconnect, and I found her. I found her 6 months ago, living above an alteration shop in the International District, working herself to death. I went to see her, introduced myself, proved who I was. We had coffee, we talked. She told me about her daughter who was a nurse, who she was so proud of, who had married a man named Marcus Chen." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "She told me she was sick. She told me her daughter was working extra shifts to help support her because her son-in-law had refused to help. She told me she didn't want to burden anyone, that she'd lived her life the way she wanted and she had no regrets. I offered her money, medical care, everything. She refused it all. She said she'd made her choices and she'd live with them. All she wanted was to see her daughter happy. So I watched from a distance. I made sure she had what she needed without her knowing it was from me. I paid her pharmacy bills, her rent, had groceries delivered and made it look like they were from church groups, and I waited for the right time to introduce myself to my niece, to explain why I'd been absent, to try to build a relationship." Richard's voice was shaking now with rage and grief. "And then yesterday, I got the call that Catherine had died, alone, in that small apartment. While her daughter was working night shifts to pay bills that I could have covered 1,000 times over if she'd let me, I called your husband," he nodded at Marcus, "to express my condolences, to let him know I was family and I wanted to help with arrangements. Do you know what he said?" Richard looked at me, his eyes wet. "He said he didn't have time for this, that he had an important dinner party to prepare for, and he hung up on me." My knees felt weak. I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself. My mother had a brother, a rich brother who had tried to help her, and Marcus had known and hadn't told me. Richard turned back to Marcus, who had gone completely white. "I came tonight because I wanted to see with my own eyes what kind of man my sister's daughter had married. I wanted to believe maybe you were just stressed. Maybe you'd made a mistake. But now I've seen enough. So let me tell you exactly what's about to happen to your career, your house, and your pathetic excuse for a life." Richard pulled out his phone and made a call, putting it on speaker. A woman's voice answered. "Legal department. This is Richard Thornton. I need you to pull the employment file for Marcus Chen, Regional Sales Director, Pacific Northwest Territory." There was typing. Then the woman's voice came back. "I have it, sir. Read me his employment status, salary, and benefits package." More typing. Currently employed at will, base salary 98,000 plus commission. Benefits include health insurance and company car lease under corporate account. Richard smiled, but it was cold. Effective immediately. Terminate Marcus Chen for cause. Grounds: gross ethical violations and misrepresentation of personal character. Flag is filed to prevent rehire at any company in our network. Cancel the company car lease and notify him he has 48 hours to return the vehicle. Send the termination letter to his personal email within the hour. Done, sir. Will there be anything else? Yes. That corporate apartment he's been living in. Pull the file on it. I felt my stomach drop. Corporate apartment. We'd been renting from a private landlord, or at least that's what Marcus had told me. Sir, the property at 4782 Harborview. Correct. That's the one whose name is the lease under. The property is owned by the Thornton Family Trust. Mr. Chen has been living there as part of his benefits package. Rent-free. Richard looked at me. Did you know that? I shook my head, unable to speak. 7 years we'd been living there, and Marcus had been making me believe we paid rent. Had been pocketing the money I'd given him for my half of expenses. Transfer the lease to my niece's name, Richard said into the phone. She's the primary resident. Marcus Chen is to be removed from the property immediately. If he attempts to return or remove any items, notify security. Understood, sir. Anything else? That's all. Thank you. Richard ended the call and turned to Marcus, who looked like he might throw up. You're fired. You're evicted. And I'm going to make sure every company in this region knows exactly why. You'll be lucky to get a job selling used cars by the time I'm done. Richard's voice was steady, final. But that's not all. I'm a wealthy man, Marcus. Very wealthy. And my sister's death has reminded me that money should be used to help family, not sit in accounts. So here's what else is going to happen. My niece is going to get a trust fund, one large enough that she'll never have to worry about money again. She's going to bury her mother with dignity and respect. And she's going to file for divorce from you using the best lawyers money can buy. And you're going to sign whatever papers they put in front of you and walk away with nothing, because I will bury you in legal fees until you beg for mercy. Marcus finally found his voice. You can't do this. This is illegal. This is wrongful termination. Richard laughed. Sue me, please. I'd love to spend some money destroying you in court, but let me give you some free legal advice. You have 48 hours to return the car and clear out anything you care about from that apartment. After that, the locks change and anything left inside becomes my niece's property, including your computer, your files, and all those financial records you've been hiding. I'd suggest you cooperate. Marcus looked around the table wildly, looking for support, for someone to say this was crazy. But David and his girlfriend were already standing up, making excuses to leave. Richard's wife was walking over to me, putting her arm around my shoulders gently. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, panic, and finally, a kind of desperate rage. He lunged at me and grabbed my arm. This is your fault. You ruined everything. If you'd just kept your mouth shut. But Richard stepped between us, surprisingly fast for a man with a cane. Touch her again, and I'll have you arrested for assault. Leave now. For a moment, I thought Marcus might actually hit me or Richard or someone, but then he seemed to deflate. He grabbed his coat from the hallway and walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. The remaining guests left quickly after that, murmuring awkward goodbyes. And then it was just me, Richard, and his wife Eleanor in the ruins of the dinner party. I sank into a chair and started to sob. Really sob, all the grief and shock and confusion pouring out of me. Eleanor sat beside me and held me while I cried, while Richard made phone calls, arranging things, taking care of details the way my mother would have if she'd been there. That night, Richard and Eleanor stayed with me. They helped me pack up Marcus's things, boxing up his clothes and belongings and leaving them in the hallway for him to collect. They made tea and sat with me while I told them about my mother, about our life, about everything. Richard cried too, mourning the sister he'd lost twice. Once when she'd run away, and again when she'd died before he could really know her again. He showed me pictures from their childhood in the Philippines. Stories about her I'd never heard, pieces of her history I'd never known. He told me about their father, a violent man who had tried to control every aspect of their lives. How Catherine had run when he'd tried to marry her off to a business associate. How she'd disappeared so completely, even Richard's money and resources couldn't find her for 3 decades. The next day, Richard paid for everything. The funeral, the casket, the service, the flowers, everything I couldn't afford, and more. My mother's funeral was beautiful, packed with people from her church, from the Filipino community, from the alteration shop where she'd worked. Richard gave a eulogy, speaking in Tagalog about his sister's courage and strength. I stood at the front in my black dress and finally felt like I could breathe, like I could mourn properly without worrying about money or Marcus or anything except saying goodbye to the woman who had given me everything. After the service, as we stood at the gravesite watching them lower my mother into the ground, Richard handed me an envelope. Inside was a check. More money than I'd ever seen, enough to cover everything and give me time to figure out my next steps. Your mother was too proud to accept help. He said, please don't make the same mistake. The divorce was quick and brutal. Marcus tried to fight it at first, claiming he deserved half of everything. But Richard's lawyers were like sharks, pulling out evidence of financial abuse, of Marcus pocketing money he'd claimed was for rent, of him refusing to help with my mother's medical expenses while spending thousands on himself. They had bank records, credit card statements, everything. Marcus had been living a double life, spending money on expensive clothes, luxury items, nights out at clubs, all while telling me we were broke and couldn't help my mother. When faced with the evidence, with the threat of Richard's unlimited legal resources, Marcus folded. He signed the papers, took his boxes of belongings, and disappeared. I heard later he'd moved to Portland, working as a car salesman just like Richard had predicted, still trying to maintain his image on a fraction of the income. As for me, Richard wasn't joking about the trust fund. He'd set up an account in my name, managed by his financial advisors, that would provide me with income for life. Enough that I could quit nursing if I wanted, could go back to school, could do anything. But I didn't quit. I loved nursing, loved helping people, and it felt like the best way to honor my mother's memory, to use the opportunities she'd given me. I did cut back on hours though, started taking care of myself, started healing. Richard and Eleanor became the family I'd always wanted. We had dinner every week, celebrated holidays together, slowly built the kind of relationship my mother would have loved to see. Richard told me stories about her constantly, filling in gaps in her history I'd never known, helping me understand where I came from. 6 months after that terrible dinner party, I returned to the apartment, the one that was now fully mine. I'd been avoiding going through all of Marcus's things, the boxers in the closet he'd left behind, but I finally felt strong enough. In the back of his closet, in a box marked office, I found files. Bank statements showing accounts I'd never known about, credit card bills for purchases he'd hidden, and letters, dozens of letters, from my mother to me that had never been delivered. She'd been sending cards and letters to our apartment for years. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, just thinking of you notes. Marcus had intercepted them all, had hidden them, had let me think my mother was distant when really she'd been reaching out constantly. I sat on the floor surrounded by her handwriting, by her love expressed in cards and careful Filipino English, and I cried. But this time, the tears weren't just grief. They were also rage. Rage at what Marcus had stolen from me, from us, from my mother who had died thinking maybe I didn't care as much as she did. But that rage, that fire, it didn't consume me. It transformed me. I became someone new, someone stronger. I started volunteering at the alteration shop where my mother had worked, teaching sewing classes to young Filipino girls, passing on her skills. I donated money to the hospital pediatric ward in her name. I learned Tagalog properly, connected with my culture in ways I never had before. I became the daughter she'd raised me to be, but also the woman I needed to be, strong and independent and unwilling to ever be silent again. And every morning, I wear her gold necklace. Every morning I touch it and remember who I am, where I came from, and what I survived. Looking back now, 3 years later, I can see that terrible Thursday night for what it really was. Not just the end of my marriage, but the beginning of my freedom. Marcus thought he was destroying me when he laughed at my mother's death. He thought he was showing dominance, showing everyone at that table who was in control. Instead, he revealed exactly who he was, stripped away the mask he'd worn so carefully, and handed Richard Thornton all the justification he needed to dismantle Marcus's life, piece by piece. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus understands what he lost. Not the job or the apartment or the money, but the chance to be loved by someone who would have given him everything if he'd just shown a shred of human decency. I would have worked myself to death for that man. I almost did. But he couldn't see value in sacrifice, only weakness to exploit. And that, in the end, is what destroyed him. Richard told me recently that Marcus tried to contact him, tried to apologize, tried to get some kind of recommendation for a job. Richard's response was simple. I don't speak to people who laugh at death. My mother's grave is in a beautiful cemetery now, not the cheap plot I'd originally arranged. Her headstone is granite with gold lettering in both English and Tagalog. It says, Catherine Reyes, beloved mother and sister, her hands built dreams. I visit every week, bring flowers, talk to her about my life. I tell her about Richard and Eleanor, about the nursing students I'm mentoring, about the small ways I'm trying to make the world better. And I thank her. I thank her for working so hard, for sacrificing so much, for teaching me strength even when I didn't know I was learning it. Because in the end, she gave me the most important lesson of all, that love isn't about silence and submission. It's about showing up, about being present, about choosing every day to care even when it's hard. That dinner party, that moment when Marcus laughed and Richard stood up, it changed everything. It gave me back my life, my dignity, my future. And sometimes, late at night, I think about what would have happened if Richard hadn't been there, if he'd been just another boss, if he hadn't been my uncle, if he'd let Marcus's cruelty slide like so many people do when they witness domestic awfulness. I think I would have stayed. I would have swallowed my grief and served the dessert and apologized to Marcus later for embarrassing him. I would have spent the rest of my life getting smaller and smaller until there was nothing left. But he was there, and he spoke, and sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to stand up and say, no, this is not acceptable. This is not how we treat people. Richard gave me that gift, the gift of seeing clearly, of understanding I deserved better. And I took it. I took it and built a life my mother would be proud of. A life where I'm not afraid, where I'm not silent, where I wake up every morning grateful to be exactly who I am. That's my story. The story of how my husband laughed about my mother's death and how that laugh became the beginning of his end and my beginning. It's not a fairy tale. There's no perfect ending, no moment where everything became easy. I still have hard days. I still miss my mother with an ache that never quite goes away. But I'm free, and I'm strong. And I know now that I can survive anything because I already survived the worst. If you're watching this and you're in a situation like I was, living with someone who makes you feel small, who laughs at your pain, who treats your grief like an inconvenience, please hear me. You deserve better. You deserve someone who sees your tears and wants to comfort you, not someone who sees them as weakness to exploit. It's not easy to leave. It's terrifying and overwhelming, and you might not have a rich uncle to swoop in and save you. But you have yourself, you have your own strength, your own worth. And that is enough. It has to be enough because sometimes it's all you have. And to everyone else watching, be the person who speaks up. Be the Richard Thornton in someone else's story. When you see cruelty, call it out. When you see someone being diminished, stand up for them. It doesn't take much, just a moment of courage, a willingness to say this is not okay. You might be the only thing standing between someone and years of suffering. Use that power wisely. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here, for being part of this community. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Was I too harsh on Marcus? Should I have given him another chance? Or did he get exactly what he deserved? I want to hear your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, if it helped you in any way, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss future stories. Your support means everything, and it helps me keep bringing you these real stories of survival, strength, and justice. I'm looking forward to reading your comments and hearing from you. On the screen, you can see 2 more incredible stories I think you'll love. There's so much more content on this channel, so many more stories of people who found their strength in the darkest moments. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, remember, you are stronger than you know, you deserve better than cruelty, and your story matters. Take care of yourselves. With love and respect, I'll see you in the next one.